The sun had barely cracked the horizon when Virginia Odell spotted the blood in the snow. Not a smear, not a few drops. A trail. She pulled her wool shawl tighter, the cold air biting at her lungs. Her boots crunched on the frost-covered ground, the only sound in the dead quiet of the morning. She'd been heading out to check her traps, a ritual as old as the sunrise itself, but this was different. This wasn't animal blood. It was too much, too red against the stark white. The trail pulled her off the path, up toward the rise where the skeletal fingers of the pine trees clawed at the pale sky. A few yards in, she saw it. A shape, dark and shuddering against the snow. It was a horse, a beautiful roan, collapsed on its side. A jagged wound tore across its shoulder, steaming in the frigid air. It tried to move when it saw her, a desperate scramble of hooves. But its legs were useless. They just crumpled. Virginia dropped to her knees beside it, her hands moving with a calm she didn't feel. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice a low hum. "You're not alone." The horse's breathing was a ragged, terrible sound. She could feel the tremors running through its body. It wasn't just cold. It was terrified. Without a second thought, she unwrapped her own shawl and draped it over the animal's neck, a small, useless gesture against a cold that deep. Then she rushed back to the cabin. She returned with linen strips, a tin of salve, and a bucket of warm water. Her fingers went numb as she worked, cleaning the wound. The horse flinched with every touch, but she was gentle, firm. As she dabbed the edges clean, she saw it. This wasn't a tear from barbed wire. The edges were too clean, too straight. It was a knife cut. A deep one. Someone had done this. As she finished wrapping the bandage, she heard it. Hoofbeats. A single rider, moving slow and steady, coming over the ridge. Virginia stood up, her body going rigid. The man was tall in the saddle, a rifle slung across his back. He dismounted without a word, his boots sinking into the snow. He crouched beside the roan, his eyes immediately locking onto her handiwork. "That one yours?" she asked, her voice tight. He nodded once, a quick, jerky motion. "Ran off yesterday. Storm spooked him." His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "You fixed him up?" "I tried." She watched his face. His eyes weren't just looking at the bandage. They were scanning it, analyzing it. There was no relief in his expression, only calculation. He finally looked up at her. "Found him at dawn?" Virginia nodded. "Wasn't going to leave him to die." He stood slowly, tall, broad, with a weariness around his eyes that had nothing to do with a single sleepless night. This was a man who hadn't slept well in years. "I'm Cade Nayland," he said, "and I owe you." Virginia glanced at the horse. "You don't owe me anything. He needed help." Cade's hand brushed the horse's mane, but his eyes never left her. "Not many would have done what you did." "I was raised better than to walk away from something hurting," she said, and her own words felt hollow. Cade's gaze sharpened. He'd heard the crack in her voice. He'd seen the flicker of pain in her eyes. "You live out here alone?" "I get by." She offered nothing more, turning her attention back to the horse. But he wasn't looking at the horse anymore. He was looking at the ground around it. He took a few steps, his head down, tracing patterns in the snow that she couldn't see. He was reading the scene like a book, and she felt a sudden sharp chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He wasn't just a rancher looking for a lost horse. He was looking for something else entirely, and she had a terrible feeling he was about to find it right here, on her land. Cade circled the wounded horse, his steps deliberate. He wasn't just a man worried about his animal. He moved with the unsettling purpose of a wolf hunting a scent. He knelt again, not by the wound Virginia had treated, but near the horse's rear leg, brushing snow away from the hoof. Virginia watched, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. What was he looking for? "He shouldn't walk far for a few days," she said, trying to break the tense silence. "You can leave him here if you want. There's a lean-to by the barn. Cade looked up, his eyes pinning her. You sure? It wasn't a question of convenience. It was a test. She nodded, forcing herself to hold his gaze. It'll keep the wind off him. I'll check on him. I'll come by tomorrow, he said, his voice flat. Make sure he's still standing. He wasn't talking about the horse's health. He was talking about something else. He was telling her he would be back, that this wasn't over. They guided the injured roan toward the small, patched-up barn. Cade walked beside her, his presence a heavy weight. He didn't offer small talk. He just watched. He watched the way she handled the horse, the way her eyes darted toward the woods, the way her hands trembled just slightly as she unlatched the gate. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and old wood was usually a comfort. Today, it felt like a trap. Cade looked around the small property. It was modest, worn but clean. The fences were solid, the water trough full. It was the home of someone who took care of things, someone who paid attention. "You've been out here long?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost conversational. It was more jarring than his silence. "Since my brother died last winter." The words came out before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," he said, and for a moment, he sounded like he meant it. She just nodded, her throat tight, and turned to busy herself with the horse's bandage. Cade watched her hands. Steady, gentle, sure. But he also saw the tension in her shoulders, the rigid set of her jaw. "You sure you're all right out here by yourself?" he asked again. It wasn't a polite question. It was an accusation in disguise. "I don't need anyone worrying for me." "That's not what I meant," he said, and his voice was low, dangerous. Virginia finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "I know." A silent challenge passed between them. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. "I'll be back tomorrow." She watched him mount his own horse and ride away, his back straight, his shoulders square. He didn't look back. Virginia let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She turned to the roan, stroking its neck. The horse nickered softly, leaning into her touch. As her hand smoothed over its mane, her fingers snagged on something. Tucked deep beneath the leather of the bridle, almost invisible, was a small, folded piece of oilskin. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't part of the tack. It had been hidden there. Her hands shaking, she worked it free. It was a small, crudely drawn map. It showed her property, her cabin, her barn. And at the edge of the cottonwood grove, just beyond the creek, was a single, dark X. The exact spot where she had buried her brother. The map felt like a hot coal in her hand. It was her land, her creek, her brother's grave. Why did this stranger's horse have a map leading to it? She shoved the oilskin into her pocket, her mind racing. The slash on the horse wasn't from wire. Cade wasn't a simple rancher. And her brother. His death hadn't been an accident. The official story was that he'd slipped and fallen while checking fence lines during a blizzard, a tragic but common fate in these parts. But Virginia had always felt a gnawing doubt. He was too careful, too skilled with the land. Now that doubt had a face. Cade's face. The next morning, Cade returned as promised. He brought oats for the horse and a small bag of coffee beans for her. It was a neighborly gesture, a performance. He was playing a part, and she had no choice but to play along. She handed him a tin cup of coffee, her hands steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "The horse is doing better," she said, her voice even. "The fever's down." Cade nodded, sipping his coffee. His eyes scanned the property again, lingering on the barn, the cabin, the tree line. He was searching. "You asked about my brother," she said, deciding to push. "You never said why you're out this way. The ranch you work for, it's a good 2 days' ride from here." He didn't miss a beat. "Chasing strays. This one," he said, gesturing to the roan with his cup. He's got a knack for finding trouble. It was a lie, smooth and practiced. He asked about her land, her dogs, how she managed the winters alone. He was gathering information, piecing together a puzzle she didn't understand. She asked nothing about him, but he offered bits and pieces anyway. A trail scout, a cattle wrangler, no family, just the road. Every word felt like a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them. One morning, while she was changing the roan's bandage, he leaned against the stall door. "You saved him, you know that?" he said. His voice was soft, laced with something that sounded almost like admiration. It was a trap. "He would have lived," she said, not looking up. "Not without you." He was trying to get under her skin, to make her trust him. "I did what anyone decent would have." "No," Cade said, stepping into the stall. "You did more." He was closer now, his shadow falling over her. She could smell the scent of leather and cold pine on him. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She had to know what game he was playing. "Because I haven't seen someone care like that in a long time," he said. And for a terrifying second, she almost believed him. She swallowed hard, her resolve wavering. This man was dangerous, not just because of the rifle on his back, but because of the way he could make a lie sound like the gospel truth. "I'm not used to people noticing," she said, the words a test. "I noticed," he replied, his voice low and intimate. He kept noticing. He helped her mend the fence, his hands sure and strong. He fixed the leak in her roof, moving with an easy competence. He hauled water from the creek, his presence becoming a part of her daily rhythm. It was a slow, deliberate invasion. He was embedding himself in her life, making himself indispensable. He wanted her to lower her guard. By the time the snow began to melt, Cade had built a new gate for her south pasture. He hadn't asked. He'd just done it. That evening, she handed him a plate of stew, and they sat on the bench beneath the cottonwood. The air was turning warmer, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of spring. "You hammer like a man trying not to think," she said, watching his face in the fading light. He took a slow bite, his jaw working. "My father used to say that, always building something when I didn't want to feel." "And what is it you don't want to feel, Cade?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. He looked at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he froze. His gaze shifted, looking past her toward the darkening woods. His hand instinctively went to his side, where a pistol was tucked into his belt. She hadn't even noticed it before. "Get inside," he said, his voice a low command. Now. Virginia's blood turned to ice. They weren't alone. Someone else was out there, watching them from the trees. And they hadn't come for a friendly visit. Virginia didn't hesitate. She scrambled inside the cabin, her hands fumbling for the heavy bar on the door. She slammed it shut and slid the thick wood into place just as Cade came in behind her, moving with a silent, lethal grace. He didn't go for his rifle. He went to the window, peering through a tiny gap in the curtains. The friendly rancher was gone. In his place was a hunter, coiled and ready to strike. "Who's out there?" she whispered, her back pressed against the cold wall. "Trouble," he said, his voice grim. "Stay away from the windows." The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, the crickets had stopped chirping. The wind died down. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Then, a voice cut through the darkness, low and menacing. "Nah, Lynn, we know you're in there. We know you have the horse." Cade didn't answer. He drew the pistol from his belt, the click of the hammer being pulled back echoing in the small cabin. He glanced at Virginia, his face a mask of concentration. "There's a rifle above the hearth. Do you know how to use it?" She nodded numbly, her gaze fixed on the weapon. It had been her brother's. She hadn't touched it since he died. "Good," Cade said. We've got maybe 10 minutes until they get impatient. Another voice called out, this one rougher. Give us the map, Nolan, and we'll let the woman live. You have my word. Cade let out a short, humorless laugh. His word isn't worth the air it's spoken on. What map? Virginia asked, her voice shaking. She knew the answer. The oilskin in her pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Cade looked at her, and for the first time the mask slipped. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret. The map that horse was carrying. The map that shows where your brother hid the money. Money? The word was foreign, absurd. My brother didn't have any money. He did, Cade said, his voice tight with urgency. He and the men outside were part of a crew. They robbed a federal payroll wagon 2 months back. Something went wrong. Your brother took the money and ran. They've been hunting him ever since. They think he made it here before he died. It was a lie. It had to be. Her brother wasn't a thief. He was a quiet, hard-working man who loved this land, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made her sick. The knife wound on the horse, the map, Cade's relentless questions. He wasn't a lawman. He was one of them. A bounty hunter, or worse, another member of the crew, here to claim his share. And you? She spat, grabbing the rifle from the mantel. What's your part in this? Are you here for your cut? Something like that, he said, his eyes fixed on the window. They're moving. Get ready. Outside, a shadow detached itself from the tree line. Then another. They were coming. The trust she had foolishly started to feel for him curdled into cold, hard fury. He had used her. He had lied to her. He had sat at her table and slept under her roof, all while hunting her brother's ghost for a bag of stolen gold. The rifle felt heavy and sure in her hands. She didn't know who the men outside were, but she knew one thing for certain. Cade Nayland was not her friend. He was just another wolf at her door. And as the first gunshot shattered the night, she raised the rifle to her shoulder, aimed it squarely at Cade's back, and wondered who the real enemy was. The blast of the gunshot from outside ripped through the cabin, making her flinch. Glass from the window pane shattered and sprayed across the floor. Cade didn't even turn. He was already firing back, a blur of motion in the dim lantern light. "Stay down!" he yelled, his voice a raw command. Her finger was on the trigger of her brother's rifle, the cold metal a stark reality against her skin, aimed at Cade's back. He was a liar, a thief. He was here for the same reason as the men in the woods, but if she shot him now, she'd be alone with them. Trapped between 2 packs of wolves, she had to choose the one she could see. She shifted her aim toward the shattered window and fired. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the boom deafening in the small space. A scream from the darkness told her she'd hit something. Cade glanced back at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "To the left of the barn," he snapped. "There's another one." They fell into a grim rhythm. Cade calling out positions, her firing, the two of them moving through the cabin like a well-oiled machine. He was fast, efficient, his movements economical and deadly. He wasn't just a wrangler who could handle a gun. He was a professional. The thought sent another shiver of fear down her spine. The shooting outside stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that rushed in was even more terrifying. "They're regrouping," Cade whispered, reloading his pistol with practiced speed. "Or they're trying a new way in." "The root cellar," Virginia said, her mind racing. "The door's on the outside, at the back of the cabin. It's old wood. They could break through it." Cade nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Is there another way out of that cellar?" "No. It's a dead end." "Then that's where they'll come." He moved toward the back of the cabin, pressing his ear against the wall. "How many are out there?" she asked, her voice tight. "3 that I can see. The leader's name is Elias Thorne. He's smart, and he's patient." He looked at her then, his face grim in the flickering light. "Listen to me, Virginia. Your brother wasn't a thief. He was working for me." The world tilted on its axis. "What?" "I'm a U.S. Marshal," he said, his voice low and urgent. Your brother James, he got mixed up with Thorne's crew, but he came to me. He wanted out. He agreed to help me bring them down, the payroll robbery. James was my man on the inside. He was supposed to lead me to the stash and testify against Thorne. Her head was spinning. A marshal? Her brother? An informant? It was too much, too fast. But something went wrong, Cade continued, his eyes never leaving the back wall. Thorne got suspicious. James knew they were onto him. He took the money and the map and ran, hoping to lead them away from you, hoping to get the evidence to me. The horse, Flint, that was his horse. The knife wound, that was Thorne's warning. He sent the horse here as a message. He knew James would try to contact you. So you lied to me, she said, the words tasting like ash. Everything. It was all a lie. I had to be sure, he said, his voice ragged. I didn't know if you were involved. I didn't know if Thorne had gotten to you. I had to play the part until I knew I could trust you. A floorboard creaked beneath them. Not from inside the cabin, from underneath. They were in the cellar. Cade held up a hand, signaling for silence. He pointed to the heavy wood planking of the floor, then looked at the cast-iron stove in the corner, where a kettle of water was still simmering over the dying embers. A desperate, insane idea began to form in his eyes. He looked at her, then at the kettle, then back at the floor. He didn't need to say a word. She knew exactly what he was thinking. They were out of time for lies and explanations. All that was left was survival. Virginia moved without a sound, her fury and confusion momentarily eclipsed by the primal need to live. She grabbed the kettle from the stove, the handle hot through her apron. Cade was already at the heavy oak dining table, silently easing it away from the center of the room, exposing the wide, rough-hewn planks of the floor. They could hear scraping sounds from below, the muffled splintering of wood as the men forced their way through the outer cellar door. They didn't have much time. Cade drew his knife and began working at the edges of one of the floorboards, prying it up. The wood groaned in protest. Virginia stood ready with the kettle, steam ghosting from its spout. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight. A U.S. Marshal. Her brother, a hero, not a thief. The world he had painted for her was shattering and reforming with every passing second. But was this new story the truth? Or just a more convincing lie? The floorboard came loose with a low crack. Cade lifted it, revealing a black, gaping hole that smelled of damp earth and rotting potatoes. A sliver of lantern light from below cut through the darkness. They could hear guttural whispers. "He's up there, with the girl. Get ready." Cade looked at Virginia and gave a single sharp nod. She took a deep breath and positioned herself over the opening. Below, a man's head and shoulders appeared, his back to them as he tried to pull himself up into the cabin. He had no idea they were waiting. Virginia didn't hesitate. She poured. The water wasn't boiling, but it was scalding hot. The man below let out a strangled, inhuman scream as the water hit his neck and back. He thrashed wildly, falling back down into the cellar and taking the lantern with him. The cellar was plunged into darkness, filled with agonizing cries and the crash of a body hitting the dirt floor. "One," Cade said, his voice a low growl. He was already moving, kicking a heavy rug over the opening. "They know our position now. We have to move." "Where?" she hissed, her heart hammering. "The barn. It's more defensible. The stalls will give us cover." He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back door. "When I open it, run straight for the barn. Don't look back. Do you understand?" She nodded, her knuckles white around the handle of the rifle. "Thorne won't expect us to run toward him," Cade said, his hand on the latch. "He'll think we're trying for the woods. This is our only chance." He looked at her, his eyes intense. "Virginia, I'm sorry I lied to you. Your brother was a good man. He died trying to do the right thing." Before she could process his words, he threw the door open. Gunshots erupted from the front of the cabin as the other men realized what was happening. "Go!" Cade yelled, shoving her out into the cold night air. The distance to the barn had never seemed so far. The ground was slick with melting snow. Gunshots cracked behind her, bullets whining past her head. She ran, her lungs burning, the rifle clutched to her chest. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw Cade, not behind her, but running in the opposite direction, toward the woods, firing his pistol into the darkness. He was drawing their fire. He was creating a diversion, giving her time to get to safety. He was sacrificing himself for her. She reached the barn and scrambled inside, sliding the heavy door shut. She leaned against it, gasping for breath, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. Cade was a marshal. Her brother was a hero. And Cade had just run into the woods to face two angry armed men, alone, to save her life. The shooting from the woods stopped. An eerie silence fell over the property. She waited, her ears straining, praying to hear his footsteps. But the only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart. Then a new sound, a slow, rhythmic creak from the loft above her. She wasn't alone in the barn. The creak from the loft sent a spike of pure ice through Virginia's veins. It wasn't the sound of settling wood or a nesting bird. It was the sound of a footstep, slow and deliberate, on the old planks above her head. Someone had been in here the whole time, waiting. Her first thought was Cade. Had he somehow circled around and gotten in without her seeing? But the sound was too slow, too stealthy. This wasn't Cade's confident tread. This was someone hiding. She flattened herself against the rough wall of a horse stall, peering into the oppressive darkness of the barn. Flint, her brother's horse, shifted nervously in the next stall over, his breath puffing in the cold air. "Nalin?" a voice whispered from the loft. It was the third man, the leader, Elias Thorne. He thought she was Cade. Her mind raced. The rifle was still in her hands, heavy and solid. She could try to shoot up through the floorboards, but it would be a blind shot. He had the high ground, the advantage. He could wait up there all night. Then she remembered something her brother had told her years ago, when they were patching the barn roof together. He'd pointed to the big hay hook and pulley system that hung from the central beam, used for lifting heavy bales into the loft. "That rope's old, Ginny," he'd said. "One good slash, and whatever's on the end of it comes down like a thunderclap." Her eyes darted up. The thick, braided rope hung down from the rafters, passing right by the edge of the loft opening before tying off on a cleat on the wall just a few feet from where she stood. A plan, desperate and terrifying, bloomed in her mind. "He's not here," she called out, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "He ran for the woods. They're chasing him." There was a long silence from the loft. She could feel Thorne weighing her words, deciding if she was a threat or a pawn. "The little homesteader?" Thorne's voice was smooth, almost conversational, but laced with venom. "Your brother was a fool, you know. He could have been rich. Instead, he got a shallow grave for his trouble." The words hit her like a physical blow, but she forced them down, feeding the cold fire of her rage. "Where's the money?" Thorne asked. "James must have told you." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, slowly, silently, reaching for the small skinning knife she always kept tucked in her belt. "He never said a word." "Don't lie to me, girl," he sneered. "We'll find it, after we're done with you." She heard another creak as he shifted his weight, likely moving toward the ladder at the far end of the loft. Now or never. With her left hand, she grabbed the thick rope. With her right, she brought the knife up and sawed at the weathered fibers. The rope was tough, thicker than it looked. For a heart-stopping second, she thought the knife was too dull. But then, one strand popped, then another. She pulled with all her might, putting her weight into it, and the rope groaned and then snapped with a loud crack. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the entire pulley system, along with the massive 100-pound iron hay hook, came crashing down from the rafters. It didn't fall straight. It swung like a giant pendulum right through the center of the barn. It smashed into the edge of the loft with the force of a battering ram, shattering the old wood planks where Thorne had been standing just moments before. A strangled cry of surprise and pain echoed through the barn, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor of the loft. He wasn't dead, but he was down. Before the dust had even settled, the main barn door slid open. Cade stood there, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. He wasn't hurt. He had circled back, just as she'd hoped. His eyes took in the scene, her with the severed rope in her hand, the shattered loft, the groaning from above. A look of pure astonishment crossed his face, but there was no time for relief. A new sound reached them both, the thunder of hoofbeats, fast and getting closer. It wasn't just one horse. It was a dozen. A posse. Cade hadn't just been creating a diversion in the woods. He'd been signaling. The two men he'd been fighting weren't Thorne's men. They were his. They were Marshall's. The barn was suddenly flooded with light from a dozen lanterns. Men poured in, rifles ready, their faces hard and determined under the brims of their hats. They moved with the efficiency of a trained unit, two of them immediately scrambling up the ladder to the shattered loft. Virginia stood frozen, the severed rope still clutched in her hand. Cade moved to her side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said, his voice low. "They're with me. It's over." Two marshals dragged a groaning, bloodied Elias Thorne down from the loft. His leg was bent at a sickening angle. He glared at Virginia with eyes full of pure hatred. "You'll pay for this!" he spat. Cade stepped in front of her, blocking his view. "Take him away," he ordered. As Thorne was hauled out of the barn, another marshal approached Cade. "We found the other two in the woods," he reported. "They won't be causing any more trouble. Did you find it?" Cade looked at Virginia, a question in his eyes. He still didn't know for sure. The map, her brother's secret. She finally let go of the rope and reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the worn oilskin. She pulled it out and handed it to him. His fingers brushed hers as he took it. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes tracing the crude lines she now knew by heart. He looked from the map to the spot outside where the cottonwoods grew thickest. "He was a brave man, Virginia," Cade said softly. "He saved a lot of lives." The marshals spent the next hour digging under the moonlit sky, and they found it. Not in a heavy chest, but in two simple leather saddlebags buried beneath the roots of the largest cottonwood. It was all there, just as her brother had promised. With the money recovered and the criminals captured, the posse began to disperse, leaving a strange quiet in their wake. The chaos was over, but the world had been irrevocably changed. Virginia stood on the porch of her small cabin, watching the last of the riders disappear over the ridge. Cade remained, leaning against the porch rail, the now empty saddlebags at his feet. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet in the pre-dawn chill. "I have to file my report," he said. "Testify at the trial. It'll be a while." The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken things. The lies he had told, the truths he had revealed, the life he had saved, the life she had taken. "You'll leave then," she said. It wasn't a question. "My job is to keep moving," he admitted, not looking at her. "There's always another Thorne, another town that needs help." She nodded, staring out at the land that had been her sanctuary and had nearly become her grave. It was stained with violence now, but it was still hers. "There's a reward for the recovery of the money," Cade said after a long pause. "A substantial one. Part of it belongs to your brother's estate. To you." She shook her head. "I don't want it." "It's your right," he insisted. "It's blood money," she said, her voice hard. "I want no part of it." He finally turned to face her. In the pale, rising light, she could see the exhaustion etched onto his face, the deep weariness in his eyes. "What will you do?" he asked. "I'll stay," she said simply. "This is my home. My brother died for it. I'm not running." He looked at her with a kind of sad admiration. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Virginia Odell." He picked up his hat from the rail, turning it over in his hands. It seemed like he was about to say goodbye, to mount his horse and ride out of her life as suddenly as he had ridden into it. But he hesitated. He looked at her small, resilient cabin, at the patched-up barn, at the faint trail of blood that was still visible in the snow. "This land," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It feels like something that stays. Most places I've been don't." Virginia's heart gave a painful lurch. It was the first honest thing he had said to her since he arrived, and it was the one thing that threatened to undo her completely. Virginia watched him, her expression unreadable. She had built walls around her heart after her brother's death, thick and high. Cade, with his lies and his mission, had blasted a hole right through them. Now, this single honest admission threatened to level them completely. "The lilacs my brother planted," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They bloomed the spring after he died. I thought it was a sign he was at peace." Cade looked over at the bare, thorny bushes near the smokehouse. "Maybe it was a sign he wanted you to stay," he said softly, "to keep this place alive." "I've done that," she said, a hint of defiance in her tone. "Alone." "You shouldn't have to be," he said, taking a step closer. The space between them crackled with unspoken tension. He was a lawman. His world was one of violence and rootlessness. Her world was this small patch of earth, this quiet fight for survival. They were impossibly different. "I don't know how to trust you, Cade," she confessed, the words hurting as they came out. "Everything started with a lie." "I know," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But everything I learned about you here, the way you cared for that horse, the way you fought for this home, that was real. You were real. I haven't been around anything real in a long, long time." He reached out, not to touch her, but just holding his hand in the space between them. A silent offering. "I have to leave," he said. "I have to see this through. But my testimony will be done in a few months. After that, my time is my own." She looked at his hand, then up at his face. The calculating marshal was gone. The weary traveler was gone. In his place was just a man, asking for a chance he didn't deserve. "And then what?" she asked. "You'll ride on to the next town?" "I was thinking," he said, a slow, hesitant smile touching his lips for the first time. "I was thinking I might know a place with a leaky roof that needs fixing, and a fence that's always in need of mending, a place where the lilacs bloom in the spring." Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, began to flutter in her chest. It was insane. It was impossible. But the thought of him coming back, not as a marshal, not as a stranger, but as a man who chose to be here. It was a thought that made the cold world feel a little bit warmer. She didn't answer him. She just turned and walked back into her cabin, leaving him standing alone on the porch as the sun finally crested the horizon, flooding the valley with golden light. He waited for a long moment, his shoulders slumped. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned to leave. As his boot hit the first step, her voice came from the doorway. "You hammer like a man trying not to think," she said, echoing her own words from what felt like a lifetime ago. He turned back. She was standing there, a small, true smile on her face. "When you come back," she said, "try hammering like a man who's found something worth thinking about." A slow, wide grin spread across Cade's face. It transformed him, chasing away the shadows and the weariness. He nodded once, a promise passing between them that needed no other words. He tipped his hat to her, mounted his horse, and rode off, not looking back. He didn't need to. This time, he knew he was coming home. Virginia watched until he was a tiny speck in the distance. She turned back to her home, the scene of so much terror and revelation, and for the first time since her brother's death, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like waiting. It felt like a beginning. The seasons would turn, the snows would melt, and the lilacs would bloom again, and he would be back. She was sure of it. What do you think? Did she make the right choice to trust him? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice and survival on the frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more tales of the unexpected.